The Last Witness. Chapter 1. The Attack. The moon hung low in the night sky, casting eerie shadows across the empty street. Paul Henderson's footsteps echoed as he hurried down the sidewalk, the cool autumn air biting at his skin. He glanced over his shoulder, feeling a prickling sense of unease. It wasn't just the darkness that unsettled him, it was the feeling of being watched. Paul wasn't usually the paranoid type, but something had been off all day. It started with a series of strange phone calls, each one silent except for the faint sound of breathing on the other end. Then there were the missed connections, people he expected to see or speak with, but who were suddenly unreachable. It was as if the world around him had shifted slightly out of focus. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden movement in the shadows. He stopped, heart racing, and squinted into the darkness. A figure emerged from the alleyway ahead, stepping into the dim glow of a street lamp. Paul froze, his breath catching in his throat. The man was tall, dressed in dark clothing, and wore a ski mask that obscured his face. Paul's instinct screamed at him to run, but his legs felt like they were rooted to the spot. The man took a step forward, and in that instant, Paul knew this was no random encounter. The stranger had been waiting for him. The air seemed to thicken as the man raised his hand, revealing a glint of metal. Paul barely had time to react before the world erupted in pain. The first blow sent him crashing to the ground, the taste of blood flooding his mouth. He tried to crawl away, but the man was relentless, each strike more brutal than the last. Paul's vision blurred as he struggled to remain conscious. He needed to stay awake to fight back, but his strength was slipping away. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was the man's eyes, cold, merciless, and filled with a terrifying resolve. Chapter 2. The Hospital. Paul awoke to the sound of beeping machines and the sterile smell of antiseptic. His body felt heavy, each movement sending sharp pain coursing through him. It took a moment for his surroundings to come into focus. The stark white walls, the thin hospital gown clinging to his battered body, the 4-drip attached to his arm. He tried to sit up, but the effort was too much. A wave of dizziness washed over him, and he collapsed back onto the bed with a groan. The events of the night before were a jumbled mess in his mind, but the pain was a constant reminder that it hadn't been a nightmare. A soft knock on the door caught his attention, and a nurse entered the room, her expression a mix of concern and professionalism. "Mr. Henderson, you're awake," she said, checking the monitors beside his bed. "How are you feeling?" Paul managed a weak nod, his throat too dry to speak. The nurse offered him a glass of water, which he accepted gratefully. As the cool liquid soothed his parched throat, memories of the attack began to resurface. "The man who attacked me," Paul rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. "Did they catch him?" The nurse's expression faltered, and she exchanged a glance with someone outside the room. A moment later, a detective stepped in, his face grave. "I'm Detective Harris," he said, pulling up a chair beside Paul's bed. "I'm afraid the man who attacked you hasn't been found yet. We were hoping you could help us with that." Paul's heart sank. The realization that his attacker was still out there, possibly watching, made his skin crawl. "I didn't get a good look at his face," Paul admitted, frustration seeping into his voice. He wore a mask, but there was something in his eyes, something familiar. Detective Harris leaned forward, his tone urgent. "Anything you can remember, no matter how small, could help us find him." Paul closed his eyes, trying to piece together the fragments of his memory. He recalled the coldness in the man's gaze, the way he moved with calculated precision. It was clear that this wasn't a random mugging. This was personal. "There was something else," Paul murmured, opening his eyes to meet the detective's. "Before he attacked me, I got the feeling he was watching me. For days, maybe longer. He knew my routine, where I'd be." Detective Harris nodded, taking notes. "We'll do everything we can to find him, Mr. Henderson. In the meantime, I suggest you stay here, where we can keep you safe." Paul's mind raced as the detective spoke. The hospital might be the safest place for now, but he knew one thing for certain. The man who attacked him wouldn't stop until Paul was silenced for good. If he wanted to survive, he needed to figure out who the attacker was, and why he had become the last witness to a crime he couldn't even remember. Chapter 3. The Unraveling. Days passed in a blur of painkillers and restless sleep. The hospital room, once a sanctuary, began to feel like a prison. Paul's mind was a whirlwind of anxiety, every creak and shadow outside his door feeding his paranoia. He couldn't shake the feeling that his attacker was still out there, lurking just beyond the hospital's sterile walls, waiting for the right moment to strike. Detective Harris visited regularly, but their conversations yielded little progress. The police had no leads, no suspects, and Paul's fragmented memories weren't enough to point them in the right direction. The frustration gnawed at him, and with each passing hour, the sense of impending doom grew stronger. One afternoon, as Paul lay staring at the ceiling, the door to his room creaked open. He tensed, but relaxed slightly when he saw it was only Nurse Williams, her kind face a welcome sight in the monotony of the hospital routine. "Mr. Henderson, I brought you something to help pass the time," she said, holding up a worn paperback novel. "I thought you might enjoy a good mystery." Paul managed a small smile as she placed the book on the bedside table. "Thanks, but I think I've had enough mystery for one lifetime." Nurse Williams chuckled softly, but her eyes held a deeper concern. "I understand, but sometimes a little distraction can help. You've been through a lot, and it's important to keep your mind occupied." Paul nodded, though his thoughts were far from the pages of the book. "Has there been any news? About the man who attacked me?" The nurse hesitated, then shook her head. "I'm afraid not. But the police are doing everything they can. You're safe here, Mr. Henderson." Safe? The word felt hollow, meaningless. Paul knew that as long as his attacker was still out there, he was anything but safe. As Nurse Williams left the room, Paul reached for the book, more out of a need to do something with his hands than any real desire to read. But as he flipped through the pages, something slipped out from between them, a folded piece of paper yellowed with age. Frowning, Paul unfolded the paper, his heart skipping a beat as he read the neatly typed words. "You know more than you think. Trust no one." Paul's blood ran cold. The note was cryptic, but its message was clear. Someone knew about the attack and they believed Paul had answers. But who had left the note? And how had they managed to slip it into his room without anyone noticing? A surge of adrenaline pushed Paul into action. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, wincing as pain shot through his battered body. He needed to get out of here to find out who was behind this before it was too late. Staying in the hospital, waiting to be hunted down like a cornered animal, was no longer an option. With shaking hands, Paul reached for his clothes, folded neatly in the small cabinet beside the bed. The effort of dressing himself was exhausting, but fear gave him strength. He shoved the note into his pocket, glancing around the room one last time. Before he could make his escape, the door opened again. This time it was Detective Harris. Paul's heart sank as the detective's eyes locked onto him, suspicion and concern mingling on his face. "Mr. Henderson, what are you doing?" Harris asked, his voice a mix of authority and disbelief. Paul hesitated, knowing he couldn't trust anyone, not even the detective. I need to get out of here. I'm not safe." Harris stepped closer, his expression softening. "I understand you're scared, but you need to let us do our job. Running away isn't going to help." Paul's mind raced, torn between trusting the detective and the fear that gnawed at his sanity. The note in his pocket burned like a brand, its warning echoing in his thoughts. "Someone left me a message," Paul blurted out, unable to keep the words from spilling out. "They said I know more than I think." "What does that mean?" Harris frowned, his eyes narrowing. "Show me the note." Paul hesitated, but something in the detective's gaze convinced him to comply. He handed over the crumpled paper, watching as Harris read it, his expression growing darker with each passing second. "This changes things," Harris muttered, more to himself than to Paul. He folded the note carefully and looked at Paul, his tone serious. "We need to find out who sent this. But for now you're coming with me. We'll keep you safe." Paul didn't resist as Harris led him out of the room, his mind spinning with questions and doubts. As they left the hospital, Paul couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into a trap, but whether it was one laid by his attacker or by those who claimed to protect him, he had no way of knowing. Chapter 4. The Trap. Paul's anxiety only deepened as Detective Harris drove through the winding streets of the city. The gray sky above matched the unease in his heart, and every shadow seemed to conceal a lurking threat. Harris remained silent, his focus on the road, leaving Paul alone with his thoughts. They arrived at a nondescript building far from the bustling center of the city. Harris led Paul inside, navigating through a maze of corridors until they reached a small, dimly lit room. It was sparsely furnished with just a table and 2 chairs. Paul's heart raced as he sat down, his mind buzzing with unanswered questions. "Stay here," Harris instructed, his voice firm. I need to make a call. Paul nodded, but the detective's departure only heightened his sense of isolation. The room felt suffocating, the silence oppressive. He tried to calm his racing thoughts, but the cryptic note and Harris's cryptic behavior only fueled his paranoia. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours before Harris returned. He sat down opposite Paul, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Henderson, there's something I need to tell you," Harris began, his tone carefully controlled. "We've been looking into your case, and it seems there's more to this than we initially thought." Paul's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" Harris leaned forward, his gaze intense. "We believe the man who attacked you is part of a larger operation. Something dangerous, something that's been in the works for a long time. You might not remember everything, but you've seen things, heard things that could expose them." Paul's mind reeled. "What are you saying?" "I don't know anything. I'm just a regular guy. I don't have any secrets." "That's where you're wrong," Harris replied, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Sometimes, it's the people who don't think they're important who are the most dangerous to those in power." Paul's breath caught in his throat. He had no idea what Harris was talking about, but the detective's words struck a chord deep within him. Could it be possible that he had stumbled upon something that had made him a target? Before Paul could respond, the door to the room creaked open. Two men entered, both dressed in dark suits, their faces impassive. Harris stood up, his expression hardening. "These men will take you somewhere safe," he said, but there was a coldness in his voice that sent a chill down Paul's spine. The men moved toward Paul, and instinctively he recoiled. "Wait, where are you taking me?" Harris's eyes flickered with something, regret perhaps, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "Just trust me, Paul. This is for your own good." Paul's heart pounded in his chest as the men grabbed him by the arms, their grip firm but not rough. Every instinct screamed at him to resist, to run, but the fear of the unknown paralyzed him. As they led him out of the room, Paul looked back at Harris, searching for any sign of reassurance. But the detective's face was a mask, offering no comfort, only the cold reality that Paul was now at the mercy of forces he couldn't understand. The endgame had begun, and Paul Henderson was caught in the middle of it. Chapter 5. The Revelation. The car ride was silent, tense. Paul sat between the two men, their presence suffocating, their faces blank masks. They drove through unfamiliar streets, heading deeper into the outskirts of the city. The buildings became fewer, the lights dimmer, until they reached an isolated warehouse surrounded by dense woods. The car came to a stop, and the men guided Paul out. He glanced around, his mind racing with possibilities, none of them good. The warehouse loomed ahead, its metal walls weathered and rusted as if abandoned for years. But Paul knew better. The place was too quiet, too still, for a place that had been forgotten. They entered through a side door, the interior as bleak as the outside. The faint hum of machinery echoed through the halls as they walked, the air thick with the smell of oil and metal. Paul's stomach churned with unease, every step feeling like he was walking deeper into a trap. Finally, they reached a large room at the center of the building. It was stark and functional, with only a single metal chair bolted to the floor in the middle. A series of monitors lined one wall, their screens flickering with grainy images from various security cameras throughout the warehouse. One of the men motioned for Paul to sit. He hesitated, but the weight of their gaze left him little choice. As he lowered himself onto the cold metal seat, the door creaked open again and a man entered the room. Paul's heart skipped a beat. The man was older, his face lined with age and experience, but his eyes were sharp, calculating. He wore a tailored suit, his movements smooth and controlled, as if every gesture was carefully measured. "Mr. Henderson," the man greeted, his voice smooth as silk. "I apologize for the unorthodox arrangements, but these are extraordinary circumstances." Paul swallowed hard, his mouth dry. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You can call me Mr. Donovan. As for what I want, let's just say that you have information that is of great interest to my employers." Paul shook his head, frustration and fear bubbling to the surface. "I don't know anything. You've got the wrong person." Donovan's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it, only the cold calculation of a predator who had cornered its prey. "You may not realize it, but you've seen something, heard something, that could expose a very delicate operation. We need to know what that is." Paul's mind raced, trying to grasp at anything that could explain what Donovan was talking about. The attack, the cryptic note, the strange behavior of Detective Harris, it all pointed to something much larger than he had imagined. But what could he possibly know that was worth all this? "I swear, I don't know what you're talking about," Paul insisted, desperation creeping into his voice. "I'm just an ordinary guy." Donovan's expression remained unchanged, his gaze unflinching. "Perhaps. Or perhaps you've been in the wrong place at the wrong time, Mr. Henderson. We've been watching you for a while now, and we know that you've seen more than you realize." Paul's pulse quickened as Donovan stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way. Tell us what you know and we can make all of this go away. But if you resist, well, I'm afraid things will get much more unpleasant." Paul's mind raced. He didn't have any information to give, at least none that he was aware of. But the threat in Donovan's voice was clear. These people were willing to go to any lengths to get what they wanted, and Paul was trapped in their web. "I don't know anything," Paul repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please, just let me go." Donovan studied him for a long moment as if weighing his words, before finally nodding to the two men who had brought Paul in. "Very well, Mr. Henderson. We'll see if we can jog your memory." The men stepped forward and Paul's heart pounded in his chest. He tried to resist, but their grip was ironclad as they dragged him toward the monitors. Donovan remained where he was, watching with a detached interest, as if this was just another routine procedure. One of the men pressed a button on the console, and the monitors flickered to life. The grainy footage shifted and changed, displaying different scenes: an empty street, a parking lot, a crowded cafe. Paul's eyes darted from screen to screen, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. And then, one of the screens caught his attention. The image was grainy and dark, but there was no mistaking it: the alley where he had been attacked. The camera angle was from above, capturing the moment he had been cornered by the masked man. Paul's breath caught in his throat as he watched the scene play out in real time, the memories flooding back with terrifying clarity. The man in the mask appeared on the screen, moving with the same predatory grace that Paul remembered. But there was something else, something that made Paul's blood run cold. In the corner of the screen, barely visible in the shadows, was another figure. A figure that had been there the entire time, watching the attack unfold without intervening. And as the figure stepped into the light, Paul's world tilted on its axis. It was Detective Harris. Chapter 6. The Escape. Paul's mind reeled as he stared at the screen, the image of Detective Harris burning into his brain. The man who had promised to protect him, who had seemed so genuinely concerned, had been there all along, watching as he was brutally attacked. Donovan's voice cut through the fog of Paul's thoughts. "You see, Mr. Henderson, nothing is as it seems. People you think you can trust are often the ones who will betray you." Paul's heart pounded in his chest as he struggled to process the revelation. Harris had been in on it from the beginning, part of the very operation that had marked Paul as a target. But why? What could Paul have possibly known that was worth orchestrating such a cruel deception? "I don't understand," Paul stammered, his voice shaky. "Why would Harris do this? What do you want from me?" Donovan's smile was cold and calculating. "Harris was doing what he was told, Mr. Henderson. We all serve a higher purpose, and in this case, that purpose is ensuring that certain information never sees the light of day." Paul's stomach churned with a mix of fear and anger. He had been manipulated, used as a pawn in a game he didn't even know he was playing. But as the reality of his situation settled in, something else began to take hold. A burning desire to survive, to fight back against the people who had put him in this nightmare. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to think clearly. If Harris was involved, then he couldn't trust anyone. But that also meant there were others, people who might be just as vulnerable, just as much in the dark as he had been. Paul knew he had to get out of there, but he needed a plan. His eyes darted around the room, searching for anything that could help. The two men stood by the door, their attention momentarily diverted by the monitors. Donovan was still watching him, but there was a slight shift in his posture. A sign of overconfidence, perhaps? The realization hit Paul like a lightning bolt. Donovan wasn't expecting resistance. He believed Paul was broken, that he had no fight left in him. But that was his mistake. In one fluid motion, Paul lunged at Donovan, knocking the chair over and sending the older man sprawling to the floor. The two men by the door reacted instantly, but Paul was already moving, grabbing a metal pipe that had been lying on the ground and swinging it with all his might. The first man went down with a grunt, the pipe connecting with his knee. The second man charged at Paul, but he was ready, dodging the attack and delivering a sharp blow to the man's temple. The man crumpled to the ground unconscious. Paul didn't wait to see if they would get back up. He bolted for the door, adrenaline pumping through his veins. The warehouse was a maze of corridors and rooms, but Paul didn't hesitate. He ran as fast as he could, his heart pounding in his ears. Behind him, he heard Donovan shouting orders, but Paul didn't look back. He pushed through door after door, each one leading him deeper into the labyrinth. The sound of footsteps echoed behind him, but Paul kept moving, driven by a primal need to survive. Finally, he burst through a door and found himself in an open loading area. The cold night air hit him like a wall, but he didn't slow down. He spotted a truck parked near the edge of the lot, its engine idling. Without thinking, Paul sprinted toward it, yanking the door open and climbing inside. The driver, a burly man with a grizzled beard, looked startled as Paul jumped into the passenger seat. "Drive," Paul shouted, his voice hoarse with desperation. "Please just go." The driver hesitated for a split second, but the urgency in Paul's voice seemed to convince him. He slammed his foot on the gas and the truck roared to life, speeding away from the warehouse. Paul slumped back in the seat, his chest heaving with exhaustion. He didn't know where they were going or what would happen next, but for now he was free. He had escaped the trap, but the danger was far from over. As the truck barreled down the dark highway, Paul knew one thing for certain. He couldn't run forever. He had to find answers, to expose the truth behind the conspiracy that had nearly cost him his life. And when the time came, he would make sure that everyone involved paid for what they had done.